What's one of the biggest industries on earth? Is it oil? Is it manufacturing? Is it shipping? No. One of the biggest industries on earth is death. And I don't mean the practical aspects of, dealing with death and burying people and this and that. No, I mean the industry that functions in order to induce in people the fear of death. Death is one of the biggest fears on the planet. I talked about the fear of God, the fear of the devil, but death is possibly the biggest fear that people have. There's an entire industry that is seeking to magnify our fear of death. There's this huge collective self-beast entity in the collective body, emotional body, seeking to force people into this fear of death, almost to the point where some people can't function. And it has enormous ramifications for people's individual lives, but also for society in terms of how people allow themselves to be controlled. And it's very, very typical of what I have explained, that there are these fallen beings who want to deceive and manipulate and control us. And they take something that is physically inevitable and they seek to use it to manipulate us. And that's why, if we are spiritual people, we have to look at this. We have to look at the fear of death, and we have to deal with it so we free ourselves from it. And certainly we need to free ourselves from the manipulation of the fallen beings surrounding death. So let's take a look at this. Now, obviously, in all the years I've been on the spiritual path and the thousands of people I met, I don't remember meeting someone who was a spiritual person and who didn't accept reincarnation. I just don't remember it. There might be some, but I don't remember meeting anybody. So the vast majority of spiritual people, we obviously accept reincarnation. In other words, we have lived before. We might live again unless we ascend and don't have to reincarnate. And this, of course, helps us tremendously deal with the fear of death, because we realize we are more than the physical body. So when the body dies, we don't die. We continue to exist, and we go to another realm for some time, and we can potentially come back into physical embodiment. So as far back as I remember, I believed in reincarnation, and I don't even remember as a child really being afraid of death. But I do remember later, when I was looking more into my psychology, dealing with my psychology, I do remember coming upon these selves, these subconscious selves that had the fear of death. But it wasn't so much the physical death, it was actually the fear of disappearing, the fear of annihilation, that I wouldn't exist anymore. And I think even as spiritual people, we can have that fear. Most people in the world, of course, that's what the fear of death means to them, especially if they believe in materialism, that their minds are just a product of the brain. Then they obviously believe that when the brain dies, they disappear as persons. They just disappear, as if they had never existed. And so for many people, that's what the fear of death means. It is that disappearance where I will not exist anymore. And I had to deal with that at a certain point. And what really helped me deal with this fear of annihilation was this teaching that I have given in the previous talks about the core of our being this conscious you, this conscious self. That makes me conscious. It makes me self-aware. Because it wasn't a matter of just understanding, it was a matter of course, experiencing this, that at the core of my being, I'm pure awareness. I'm not the physical body, but I'm not even the outer personality. And when I logged into this and experienced this, I realized that this conscious you, it can't die. it's not going to die. It's not going to disappear just because the physical body died. Even if the outer personality disappeared, the conscious you would still exist. But of course, you can say there can still be a fear there that the person that I see myself as, the person I think I am, the person I've been working my whole life to build, and possibly in many lifetimes build this personality I have, that could disappear. And what would that mean? Well, a teaching that helped me a lot in this respect was a teaching that the Ascended Masters have given actually for many years, going back to the 1930s, that we have a higher self, which the Masters call the I Am Presence. And the I Am Presence exists in the spiritual realm. Now, the I Am Presence hasn't become an ascended being, an ascended master. It's not an immortal being yet, because the I Am Presence is created, it's our individuality that's created to be part of this unascended sphere, to evolve in this unascended sphere. So the I Am Presence is our divine or spiritual individuality. And it's anchored in that. And it's your I Am Presence is absolutely unique. 7 billion people on the planet, but yours is unique. Billions more in the universe, but we each have a unique I Am Presence, created by the Ascended Masters who are our spiritual parents. And that I Am Presence, the reason why it functions this way is that the I Am Presence exists in the lower realm of the spiritual realm. Which means that no matter what happens in the unascended sphere, the I Am Presence couldn't be lost. It's complicated to create an I Am Presence with this unique individuality. So the Ascended Masters don't run a risk losing it. So the I Am Presence is there, and it sends an extension of itself into embodiment, namely the conscious you. But the conscious you also cannot really be lost, because it is, as I've said, it is this pure awareness. It has, as a result of being pure awareness, it has the potential to create any kind of personality it wants in the world, and go into that personality and experience the world. Which means that the conscious you can have any experience in this world of form that it can imagine. And it's like I've said, you're going into a theater, you're putting on the costume and the makeup, and you play a certain part in the play until you've had enough of it, and then you play another part, and until you've had enough of playing any part that could be played on earth, and then you can ascend. But I've also said that there's a potential that people can go into duality. They can go to the lowest level of consciousness possible on earth, but the fallen beings have gone even below that, and they can go very far below. So there can come a point where the I Am Presence says, I have experienced what I want to experience through the conscious you. I'm going to withdraw the conscious you from me, to me, back to me, and from earth, from being an embodiment. And at that point, of course, whatever outer personality the conscious you has built, even if it's a fallen being who over a long, long time has built a very elaborate outer personality, that outer personality will disappear. It will just disappear. There's actually something called the second death. So there is that possibility, but it's only a possibility for the fallen beings, that the outer personality will disappear that way. So in a sense, this fear of disappearance, I realized at a certain point that this is not a real fear. It's projected by the fallen beings. It's projected through that outer personality, through that separate personality, because some of the fallen beings have realized it could be lost. It could be lost, the outer personality. Now the conscious you and the I Am Presence will not be lost. And here's the magic of this. The I Am Presence is experiencing the world through the conscious you. And the conscious you is experiencing the world through the outer personality that we have built in our identity, mental, and emotional bodies. But the I Am Presence is processing our experiences in a different way than the conscious you is. Which means that the I Am Presence, no matter what experience we have on earth, it's learning positive life lessons from that experience. So you can say that you had a very, very difficult and abusive childhood in this lifetime. And obviously it was very traumatic, and it affected you deeply, and it affected the conscious you and how you experience life on earth. But your I Am Presence still had a positive learning experience from that trauma. And it learned who I am not, how I relate to the world of form, how I can be a co-creator, what works, what doesn't work. And I know this can sound insensitive to people who have experienced deep trauma, but I can assure you, even though I had a fairly easy childhood in this lifetime, I have experienced trauma in past lifetimes. So I don't think any of us really are worse off than the rest of us. We have all experienced trauma either in this lifetime or in past lifetimes. So when I started realizing this, I could say, I could sort of make peace with the way things are on earth. I could say, well, it doesn't really matter. It doesn't really matter what I have gone through here on earth. Because what matters is the positive lessons that my I Am Presence has learned from this. So things are obviously difficult on earth. Earth is an unnatural planet. But still, my I Am Presence is learning positive lessons from it. And then, of course, along with this came the realization that, yes, I have experienced deep trauma. It affected me deeply. But the effect is only in these subconscious selves. The conscious you hasn't been changed by anything I have experienced. And therefore, I have the potential to become aware of these selves, to become aware of the energy stored in them, to call to the Ascended Master to transform the energy, to come to see the illusion behind that self, and to let the self die. And then the conscious you can return to the innocence that I came down with, that neutral, pure awareness that I came down with. And I can actually come to the point where I can be an embodiment. I can look on earth with this innocence, this neutral state of mind. And that's when you really overcome the fear of death. Because you realize that even though the outer personality could die or could be traumatized, you are more than this. You won't die when the outer personality dies. And this was tricky for me to understand. Because as I said, we have this stage on the spiritual path between the 48th and the 96th level of consciousness, where we are actually building a spiritual sense of self. We are, so to speak, building a spiritual personality or persona based on the spiritual teachings we have. And as I was doing this, I was thinking, well, this is the spiritual personality that will ascend to heaven. As I've described, I found my second spiritual movement that talked about Ascended Masters, the possibility of ascending. It also talked about we go through all of these initiations, and we are walking the path, putting on Christhood. And I really thought in the beginning that this outer personality that is built based on a spiritual teaching and a spiritual understanding, that this is what will ascend. One day it will become so perfect that it will ascend. And it took me many years to start being willing to question this. And it was only because the Ascended Masters gave some very profound teachings on this, about the separate selves. And I came to realize that the outer personality is built in reaction to conditions on earth. Now, I may have built my personality for a long time based on some spiritual awareness and spiritual teachings, but it is still based in reaction or built in reaction to conditions on earth. And I started realizing this, as Jesus said, only the person who descended from heaven can ascend back to heaven. And I started realizing in Buddhism, what I talk about also overcoming this outer self that causes suffering. And I started realizing that this had to fall away. the outer personality just had to fall away. And gradually, and it took years, but gradually I made peace with the fact that, oh yeah, this outer personality is not who I am. Of course it has to fall away for me to ascend. Now this is not to say that everybody has in their life plan to ascend after this lifetime. So you may still be in a phase where you are building that spiritual personality and you're thinking you need to perfect it. And if this is the experience that you have put in your life plan that you want to have, no problem with that. You can then continue after this lifetime embodying again and again. But I came to the point where I realized it's part of my life plan to ascend, and I realized that in order to qualify to ascend, the outer personality has to fall away. And it was when I realized that I really could let go of this fear projected by the fallen beings that the outer personality could be obliterated, could disappear, could be annihilated. Because then I could look at these projections when the fallen beings projected that at me and say, well, so what? The real being that I am will just ascend then. What's the big deal? And when you come to that point, you gain a different perspective on things on earth, because it's like you don't fear death. You don't fear going to hell, because you know you can't go to hell. It's only the outer selves that could polarize you to hell. And, what is there really to fear? And if there's nothing to fear on earth, then that's freedom. It's like St. Paul said in one of his letters that you can be in the world, but not of the world. And that's really the state that we are striving towards when we go above the 96th level, where we are in the world, we are living in the world, we are living a practical life, but we're not identified with it. We're not controlled by it. We don't allow us to think that our identity, our thoughts, our emotions, our reactions are determined by the world. And that's when we can start reacting in a different way than we have done before, and in a different way that most people do. And that's one of the aspects of spiritual growth and personal Christhood. We demonstrate there's a different way to react than what most people do. And this is part of our role as spiritual people. But in order to get to that point, really, it's enormously helpful to let go of this fear of death, to confront it. And as I've said with the other fears, at some point you just have to go into it. I did the same thing. I closed my eyes, sat in a quiet room, and I just, okay, if I was to die this moment, what then? Let me go right into that fear. And you go through the whirlwind of emotions, you go into the eye of the hurricane, you're standing there, and you can say to death, come and get me if you have any power. And if you don't die, well, then the fear dies. And then you're free of it. And that gives you, really you could say that's when you can start living. When you overcome that fear of death.